Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast is either a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education, or an episode with a guest or multiple guests. In this week's episode, I'm interviewing Addison Lilholt, and we discuss Addison's dream job, which is an acronym, the importance of students having fun through meaningful learning experiences, lessons learned from remote teaching, the importance of mental breaks when learning and teaching, recommendations for getting started with computer science, the intersections of computer science and environmental science, creating an arcade cabinet to explore engineering and computer science, being open about iterating on abilities as an educator, and so much more. As always, you can find a link to the show notes in the app that you're listening to this on, or by visiting jaredoleary.com, where there are hundreds, if not thousands, of free computer science education resources. And speaking of, this podcast is powered by BootUp, which is the nonprofit that I work for, where I create 100% free elementary coding curriculum, and we also provide paid professional development. So check out bootuppd.org if you're interested. But with all that being said, we will now begin with an introduction by Addison.
My name is Addison Lilholt. Thanks for having me to the podcast today. I am the middle school Dream Lab coordinator at the Baldwin School in Pennsylvania, as well as the chair of the computer science department and engineering department. And those are my passions, those two things that I get to teach every day. So
the audience likely understands what it means by coordinating like computer science, but what is the Dream Lab?
Oh, great question. DREAM's an acronym. It stands for Design, Robotics, Engineering, Art, and Mathematics. So it's all of those things. It's an umbrella, a catch-all, and we've decided to dedicate a space, well, 3 spaces actually, one in the lower school, one in the middle school, and one in our high school, where students can really pursue each of those areas. I think one of the main goals that we try to encourage in our students is to not fear making mistakes in their work and focusing as much on the process as in the product of what it is they're doing, if not more. The process being the design process. So it's really a space for them to experiment and learn about their own ways of doing things in these fields.
The way that some people use acronyms like that, whether it's DREAM or STEM or STEAM or whatever, it tends to be siloed for each one of the letters. Is it siloed within this space, or are they all intersecting and interwoven together?
At times, they can be interwoven. At other times, if it's a robotics unit, we're talking about robotics. However, we've just introduced a new course that operates within the Dream Lab in the middle school. So interdisciplinary design is a course where we talk about how many projects require multiple disciplines in order to make it happen. So the Dream Lab is a space where we can do that as well. So yeah, at times things are interwoven. And sometimes we actually branch out now more so than before. In the past 3-4 years, in the middle school at least, we've been bringing on board teachers from outside of the CS and engineering department, teachers from the English department and the languages department and the music and art department. They are now sharing our spaces, and we're working together to build these, well, truly interdisciplinary projects.
That sounds like a dream job. Sorry, I had to say it.
I might use it sometime.
Do it. Missed opportunity if you don't. No, but in all seriousness, like that really does sound like an interesting job that I would love to, 1, participate in as a student, but then 2, to be able to like facilitate those experiences, the explorations, and then the collaborations with other educators. That sounds wonderful.
If you have the time, it's a really neat experience to be able to create projects and then have experts from those fields contributing to those projects all simultaneously. So if there's an English component that's actually truly important to that project, you have the English teacher there. Right at that point. So yeah, it makes for the in the moment, that works out really well. But then the end product typically does end up turning out really great.
Now, if somebody were to walk into like that space, or even if you wanted to think specifically like an ideal computer science space, what would they experience or observe?
They would experience the students having fun. That's ideal. Ideal every day. Students having fun. and learning. That's number one. But I think there needs to be meaningful interactions with whatever it is they're learning about. I think in the Dream Lab with computer science, I'm really hoping that if somebody walked in, they saw the students engaged with this very broad class of computer science, the curriculum. There's tons of areas of computer science that we just expose them to in seventh grade. And then they can continue down that path in the high school. But in the seventh grade, I want to engage them with the things they use all the time and have them take ownership in their own creations in this space.
Right.
When people do come into my space, because this happens often, we have guests that come through and they do come into my space. And I think if I was to walk into this space and I didn't know about what it is I do, I would be very confused. I would walk into the space thinking I'm in a typical school and I would see what would appear to be chaos. And that would make sense to most people walking into my lab. It does look like somewhat chaotic, but it is controlled chaos. What it is really is the individual students or individual groups of students taking ownership of the work that they're doing and understanding their own dynamics within their groups or their own individual work styles. So they might be standing at the tables, they might be standing at the whiteboards, they might be sitting on the floor, they might be talking to each other, they might be with their headphones on. Everybody's doing what it is that they need to do in order for them to be as successful as they can be. And I've found that during those moments of hands-on work, if the framework is set up correctly, you walk in, it doesn't look like your typical classroom, but it's very effective.
Yeah, it can be hard to design for the many ways of like doing, being, and experiencing in a classroom like that. And that's the harder part. Facilitating that, for me at least, it was easy because you're walking around, interacting one-on-one with groups. Like, that was the easy part. So if somebody would come in and be like, oh, Jared's not really doing much, like not up there lecturing, like, you're right, sort of. I'm asking a lot of guided questions because I'm trying to help them get to where they want to go. But like, what you're missing is the hours of work that went into designing this experience, and especially designing an experience that supports multiple ways of experiencing whatever it is we're exploring.
That is exactly right. We're currently doing some work, and I showed something about Wicked, the musical, and they kind of explored the engineers who designed all of the framework for the stage and all of the contraptions in the air with the ropes and all of this stuff. They have this huge head that has a mouth that opens up and its eyes can move in different directions. And then they go around back, and the guy's conducting an interview, and he shows the mechanism. It's a handlebar, like on a bike, and it can pull out. And now the person in the backstage has full control of this head. I mean, this is a 10-foot head, and this is happening live on stage during these Wicked performances on Broadway. And I show this to my students because I think in the process of these projects, there is an audience often, and they see that project. They see what's going on stage. But to go backstage and to look at it from all of these other points of view, all the people that had to become part of this end result, which is whatever, an hour and a half of a performance, they begin to see that the process is the backstage of their projects. And it's pivotal in them having success. And all of their learning really is happening during that process, the design process in our case. So I think it was a good analogy to what they do in our classroom. And I mean, these engineers that put this show together and any of these shows, the amount of thought that goes into it and the multiple disciplines. There was a scientific aspect. There were these bubbles that were being blown out of the mouth of this big head. And they had to design a specific solution that if it would float and it would become a bubble very quickly. But then the property of it, when it landed and popped on the floor, it didn't leave any slick residue so that the dancers wouldn't slip. Science, right? So it's funny how so many different disciplines come together to make something that many people would think, oh, they need music and dance.
Right.
Those would be the first two things, and probably art. Those would be the first three major ones, but there's a lot that goes into it.
How would your answer compare or contrast if you were to have been asked that question before COVID happened? Like, would it be the same or would it differ?
That's a good question. because COVID has happened. I don't think my approach would have changed with regards to making sure that the students understood the value of collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
We actually focus on collaboration as a key benchmark in what we do. It's critical, really. We wouldn't have as much success if the students didn't work together. When we went remote, we had to problem solve as teachers. We then took on the role that I often put on my students. Solve this problem, go there, do this. This isn't easy, figure it out. We don't have the answer. I tell the students to do this all the time. Now we're thrown into this crazy situation where, okay, you're never going to see your students for the next, we don't know when. So you don't even have that answer. Number two, yeah, let's try this new thing. Everybody's going to be on their computers for, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 hours a day. Oh, by the way, nobody's ever done this before. Nobody knows how to do it.
Yep.
For me, oh, by the way, you're going to set this up. Oh, whoa, okay. So cool. I don't really know what I'm doing, but if you're cool with me trying stuff, I'm fine with trying stuff. Oh, by the way, our LMS just broke because there were too many users on it. Oh, cool. So now we have to switch LMSs within 2 days of the switching over to virtual. This all happened, right? And we were problem solving in real time, in the moment, and it was messy. And I remember not knowing how it was going to end. And you know what? If it wasn't for thinking in the way that the students think and being vulnerable in that moment and just saying, this could fail, but we got to give it a shot. We don't have any other options, really.
Right.
We would have been in a bad place, but we were able to right the ship. We were able to get online. We were able to teach the teachers how to teach in this way to some degree. I mean, teaching remotely, it is not ideal if you've been teaching in person and if the student has only had an in-person experience from the teacher. Teaching remotely, it can be effective. And I think we had found ways to make it more effective. But is it ideal? I think there's a lot of value in the in-person interaction. And then when it comes to Dream Lab, I mean, we're hands-on. So there's definitely that piece. But I think with COVID, it gave us a real-world example of how people need to be able to solve a problem, given whatever it is you have on hand, without knowing the outcome at all.
Right.
COVID's thrown everything out the window for me because teachers plan. Teachers often come up with really good plans. They can, and I do this too. I build out these unit-long plans, right? And when COVID hit, every single one of those was gone for the most part because of the constraints I was given. What I've learned in COVID is that not only myself, but people in general, and my students, I've learned this about, are very, very resilient. And if they're given the opportunity to be resilient, they will take it. They'll often exceed expectations. When I started realizing some of this while we were remote, and I was seeing a decline in my student interest. This was happening across the board, across the country, across the world. Everybody was zooming in and tuning out. I really started to come up with new ways to do it all. And I found it to be successful. And I wouldn't have ever even dabbled in any of the things that I did if it weren't for COVID. I mean, I turned my entire class for computer science specifically into a TV show. It became a talk show called the CS Show. And I was broadcasting live every day to my audience. And my students were my audience. The CS Show was live. I had daily interviews that I would pre-record and interview and cut and splice videos and put it all together. I would have them come on stage. I was air quoting that. They would join into the conversation. They wanted to be on camera. They wanted to even join the conversation. And oftentimes they would give me ideas for the show, for upcoming shows. There would be games in the shows because why not? Let's have a game show, right? And then I would gamify whatever it was we were working on. I mean, it was silly. I had like a monologue at the beginning of every class. That was my intro. And like, what are we doing to? Well, I just turned it into a monologue and we were having fun. And even though we were all remote, I had students giving me weather reports from their rooms and they would open the window shade. They would say, hey, Mr. Lilholt, it's snowing today, right here in so-and-so Pennsylvania. And at one point, one of my students wasn't in the country. They were over in Switzerland. And I said, oh, well, we need to have a daily international weather update. Now, this has nothing to do with computer science at all. but I created a little intro for them, and it was like, so-and-so with today's international weather. But they just didn't know what was going to happen
Right.
in the next class. And to keep students on their feet, I think there's some real value in that. And if you can do that in a pandemic, and you can do that via some remote weird situation, I think I did okay.
And has some of those approaches transferred over into in-person experiences?
Yeah. What worked, I took back and brought it with me back into person. But some of it I left back there in Zoomtown. Because, I mean, sitting behind a screen all day, that's tough. So with computer science, I think one of the things we need to remember is computer science isn't only conducted on a computer. There are times where there's a lot of necessary collaborative work that goes into a project. In fact, today, students were working on whiteboards, developing flowcharts for their work. I think that's just as important as getting them back onto a computer to code.
Right.
Some of it I took back. The weather thing, because we're all in the same room now. So we all know what the weather is outside. But I did do something. What was it? It was something like that. And I think it was like the lunch update. And the students had like just come back from lunch. And I heard them talking about lunch. And I just go up to a student. I heard you talking about lunch. Should we make an announcement about this for everyone? So I stopped the class. Now they're in the middle of their work. We take a break. I say, listen, I've been talking to so-and-so. This is critically important. We all need to pay attention for about the next 30 seconds. Public service announcement. The pizza today was phenomenal. And I have so-and-so here to back me up. Tell us about the pizza. And doing that at the end of each semester is a student assessment of myself. I ask about all this stuff. Now, they may just be lying, which is fine because it's building my self-esteem. But I think they're telling the truth. And they find it to be a welcoming place. And they find themselves, because of the space we create in these dream labs, the students aren't afraid. They're not afraid to take those risks in their projects where, hey, you know what? You put these next few popsicle sticks on that thing, there's a great chance it's going to completely fall apart and you're not going to have anything at the end. Or you're going to complete the whole thing and it's going to look amazing and nobody's ever done that. They're not afraid to take those risks. They're not afraid to have the risk completely fail on them. And I think that's really important. Because in the end, they learned whichever conditional path they just went down, they learned something and it was worthwhile.
So back when I used to teach drumline, it was very skill-based. So it's all about like performing something and playing very consistent with it. So you'd sit there and you'd rep stuff sometimes for like an hour or two, just like the same thing over and over, just keep going through it, refining as you go along. But I noticed that students' attention span would start to wander at times because it's hard. It's mentally draining to practice the same thing over and over. So it was good to sometimes just like, hey, let's take a fiver. Let's just get a water break. Let's just like talk about your day. It's more personable and it allows them to just kind of like press the refresh button on their brain and then be able to come back and not be as mentally drained and make it so that they're more focused when they actually come back to it. So I like that idea of like, hey, sometimes it's good to just take a break. But I have seen some administrators who would look at that and be like, wait, this has nothing to do with the content. Like, you had mentioned that the number one thing for you is having fun, but an administrator is going to look at like the assessments and go, I don't see a standard for having fun. Like it's all about learning these concepts and practices. Have you had any pushback from admin when you do these breaks or when you focus on enjoyment in learning?
I would imagine there are probably schools where I would have that, but not here.
So it is a dream job. Ah.
It is and you know what? This is the phrase that I was trying to think of earlier. Teamwork makes the dream work. It is a dream job, but I got to say, I'm pretty lucky. There was some proving that had to happen over the course of a few years, also with parents and community. But I think at this point, I've developed enough of a rapport with everyone that they know that I have the students' best interests in mind in every interaction I have with them and in every plan I make for them. I feel confident that that's why I'm able to do some of the things that an administrator would have no reason to say, keep doing that, except it is yielding great results.
Right. So I'm actually interested in that like your journey. So if you were to write a story about your journey into education and into CS education in particular, what would the chapter titles be? And then like what sparked your different transitions between the different chapters?
So many chapters. Chapter 1, birth. No, I'm kidding. We won't go back that far. So I'd say chapter 1 would be undergraduate degree question mark. Because I got a degree in food marketing, so it wasn't even in education. Through that, though, I got into computer science. I was doing work with various different companies throughout my college career. With my brother, we had started a web design LLC. It was a lot of fun. And it was kind of when the internet was starting to really kind of get going. Chapter 2, I went into the business world. Chapter 3, I quit the business world. Chapter 4, I went back to school for education. Chapter 5, I graduated and became a teacher in the field of science, specifically science. So I didn't go straight into CS. And I was teaching a lot of different sciences. I was teaching chemistry, biology, physics, and environmental science. And I tried to tie environmental science into everything I did. The first school I taught at was an environmental-based charter school. So it was my first experience in a public school setting, albeit it was a charter. So I started honing my craft there. I think one thing, I always look back on these weird life experiences, and you've been mentioning the music side of this, and I've played instruments my whole life, and I played in a band. So I've been on stage number of times throughout my college career and then beyond and even up until now. And there's some carryover that I've noticed. And I remember realizing that as an early teacher, I was like, you know what? I think I can use this skill that I didn't learn in any of my classes of getting up on a stage and performing and use some of the tricks that I've learned over the course of the years that got the audience engaged with the students. And so that's what I would do at the beginning. And I didn't realize kind of what I was doing right away, but then I looked back on it and I said, that's what I was. So chapter 5, kept teaching there for a while and met my wife there. She was a kindergarten teacher. So speed up to chapter 6, get married, 7, start at this school. And I've been here now for 5 years. So half a decade. And now I'm here. Now I'm where I am. And when I was at the previous school, I had started going down this CS path just because I started seeing so much opportunity there. It was a passion of mine that was outside of school. And I started doing things like robotics clubs and engineering programs. And then I did develop their engineering and computer science program at that school and implemented that 2 years before I left. So they had then the curriculum, and that was driven by standards within the state, but also just kind of how I saw it impacting sciences and the environment. And then now I'm here, still doing all the fun stuff. The stuff that I teach, they are the things that I do outside of school as well, just for fun. I was talking to my colleague and she said, yeah, PD for us, professional development for us, is a little strange because for a computer science teacher, sometimes it's just as important to sit in a session, listen to a presenter, as it is to stumble through learning this new language or trying to program this new thing to do this specific. And she said, I think I do a lot of PD, but it's not technically PD per se. Said, that's an interesting thing in computer science.
If somebody wanted to jump into CS, but they were unsure where or how to start, what might you recommend for them if they're an educator?
Focus on your interests. That would be my first statement. I often have parents ask the same question, like, where would be a good place for my student to get started in CS? I think it goes the same for a teacher. Ask yourself, why do you want to get into CS? What is CS going to do for you? Why? Are you trying to get into, game design? Is that something that's fun to you and you want to add that to your curriculum and you want to start, creating games and doing that? Do you want to teach a specific type of coding language because you see that as something that's important for them to know, just as another foreign language is. So I would ask why. And then I would say, there are so many resources out there right now, and there are so many ways to be a self-starter in this field. Many of the people that are in the field are either self-starters, they started in some classroom and they fell in love, and then they just kept going outside of the classroom. Why not now, though? Why not do it? Explore it. What's the worst that can happen? You can have some fun.
Yeah, that answer definitely resonates. That was the approach that I took. So it was largely making music and art through computer science, programming, etc. That's what really got me into it, exploring those questions and those interests. And I've had multiple guests mention similar things. I am curious, though, you mentioned how you tried to infuse environmental sciences into what you're doing. What about the intersections of CS and environmental sciences?
Yeah. I gave you a little pause there. We can keep that in because, first of all, CS is basically everywhere. But CS and environmental science, there is such a clear connection with what computer science can do for the environment. It can predict things. It can use sensors to show us what we can't see in the environment. These are exciting things for me. We had a pond, and there was a culvert that was underground that ran from the top of the hill down to the bottom. And this water was kind of recycled. And it was blocked. It got blocked by debris, and the culvert couldn't run. And luckily it was the winter time. So it wasn't going to be running anyway, because it would have likely had frozen. Once we needed it to start running again, we would have had a big problem with algae if we hadn't got it back running. So what did we do? Well, I posed this problem to the students and I said, well, what could we do? We don't know where this issue is. We don't know what's happening. We just know that when we turn the pump on, none of the water is getting back down where it should go. They said, well, Mr. Lilholt, we got to find the smallest student in the class and send them up that pipe. And I said, although that sounds like a fantastically safe idea, can we find an alternative? And they did, obviously. They said, well, why don't we build a robot, send it up there? And that's what we did. And we took a ton of river rocks from the pond, brought them into the classroom so we could set up the testing site so we didn't have to go all the way down there every single time. And we started programming robots to see if we couldn't build a robot, engineer the actual physical thing, and get it to move just in one direction. They were like, well, how can we see? Hook up a camera to it. Oh, okay. So you have a cell phone? Yeah, throw that on there. So creative ideas, finding solutions, and showing the students these real world connections between CS, a problem that needs to be solved, and connecting it and making it very clear the connection to these other disciplines like environmental science. Here is the connection. Just so you know, this literally is there. There are people in their mid-40s in this role working and getting paid for this. So making those connections for the kids.
When I like your connection with engineering as well, one of the projects that you mentioned before we spoke was another CS and engineering connection that you made, and it was the arcade cabinet. Could you elaborate on that project?
The arcade cabinet was an undertaking that I was uncertain about. There were two arcade cabinets. The first arcade cabinet was built by my students in an engineering class in the Dream Lab. They wanted to build a full-scale size arcade cabinet using a Raspberry Pi Zero, a display I had sitting around, and then they wanted to learn some power tools and, figured out the plans. We made a scale model out of cardboard, and then we really got into the weeds and got this thing up, right? And they thought this was really cool. And you could upload RetroPie to it and be able to play any game from, PlayStation down. Then what ended up spawning from this arcade cabinet was the fact that my computer science students were designing their own video games using a platform called MakeCode Arcade, which is by Microsoft. Well, it turns out they have a version of RetroPie for their games. So what you were able to do is flash the image to be able to play any of their games. So now the students started designing their games. They finished their games. They create their games. We upload their games to the arcade cabinet. Now there is no RetroPie on there. There's only student-made games and a splash screen that I put on. But it just shows like to be able to go into an arcade and play a game. It wasn't just the person making the box and the full upright. It wasn't just the programmers. It's a lot of people. Second one I made, I tweaked it. And I love using this term iteration with the students. I said to myself, I don't want to use as much wood. And how can I do that? So I wanted to be able to do this with about one sheet of plywood. I had a mini fridge. So I used that as the base, built two sides, and I was able to fit the whole thing, make it out of one sheet of plywood. And then I brought that picture in to show the students. I continually want to show them, I'm doing this stuff too with you.
Right.
And we can partner on this stuff. I mean, I assign teams all the time. I say I'm the team member of all, and I'm happy to help, but I'm not doing all the work. And neither should one person in any of your group.
So I'm curious, like in both the arcade project and then even the project where you're clearing out like some rocks and whatnot, there's a breadth of understanding that like concepts and practices and standards that would go across many different disciplines. But then there's also the depth of like creating and diving really deep into something. For you, like when you are designing a project, where do you like land in terms of conceiving of the breadth versus depth argument that often occurs?
I'll start with CS because when we were developing the curriculum as a department for the middle school, this was a question we asked ourselves. Do we want to go really deep into, let's just say, one specific language? Or do we want to expose the students to a whole bunch of really neat, really cool, really real world applicable things happening in CS right now and into the future? Well, we opted for that. And that's our approach right now to CS. So we do not just focus on one language. And we don't even focus on solely languages. I mean, we get into cybersecurity, AI, machine learning, web design, of course, but robotics, game design. I mean, there's a lot that we touch on. But then if I can spark the interest in those few classes we have together in that one specific area, now that's good, because if they're interested in it, I can give them additional resources. This is something I always do. I always, at the end of a unit, here's a whole bunch more that this is not homework. Absolutely not homework. Don't do this if you don't want to do this. But for anybody that wants to go a little further and keep playing and keep tinkering and keep making, check this stuff out. You're going to have fun. And then the hope is, so 7th to 8th grade, then they can keep dabbling in 8th grade in interdisciplinary design, where they can, if they're into the CS stuff, bring it in. You'll be the CS people. Then they can start to go deeper in when they get into high school. It's all scaffolding. So it's growth over time. We try to have a growth mindset in the things we do. Computer science, it's just so broad. So if we just focused in on one aspect of it, personally, I think it's a disservice for them.
I'm curious if we were to zoom out. So what do you feel is holding back educators or the field? And then what's something that we can do about that?
I think what's holding us back as educators working in the field, I think I'm privileged to have the opportunity to honestly not feel held back. I'm given the chance to really approach education in a different way. And my department as a whole, I think we all do the same thing, more so from a holistic view of what are the students coming away with at the end of the day. There are a lot of life lessons that occur in these years, these formative years. I think to my own daughter and think about all of the points that she mentions from her day when I get home. And I think about that for all the students when they go home. And what would hold me back from making that the best experience? Time holds us back. The opportunity to collaborate. I think if you give people these chances of opportunity, the results become greater. The ability to redefine how assessment looks. There are a lot of different ways to look at success and track success, define success. I'm hopeful that education on the whole is going to be okay. I'm hoping that CS becomes as important in schools as it is in everyday life, and as ubiquitous in schools as it is in everyday life.
Yeah, who can predict with what's happened over the last couple of years? Like, my magic 8-ball has not been very great lately. With what you're just saying, you use the word redefining, and that stood out as something that It sounds like you have done several times when you're talking about your different chapters in your life, like redefining what direction you're heading in life, how you're going to explore, etc. Being a musician, I'm a bit of a practice nerd. I really nerd out on practice techniques and how to do it, how to iterate on abilities. I'm curious, how do you iterate on your abilities either in computer science and your understandings or as an educator?
There are so many similarities with music and computer science. Every time I'm doing things in code or just in the field in general, I'm finding these connections and I'm like, oh my gosh, loops. I continually seek to get better though. I'll find the way. So it's kind of this individual instinct to keep going, keep learning new things. I mean, I make it a point every day, once my kids go to bed, to learn something in one of these areas of interest. And it's not like a long amount of time. It's like 15 minutes or whatever. Read a book, go online, check something out, try something new on the computer, watch a YouTube video, do it all. And I've just gotten to this constant rhythm of trying to learn new things. And what I'll often end up doing, and it drives me crazy, I'll learn something new that night and I'll think about it. And then I'll, go to bed and I'll be thinking about it in my mind. I'll fall asleep eventually. Sometimes it keeps me up. Sometimes I even have to take a note about it because I'll come up with some idea. And the next day, I'm like looking forward to trying that thing. That's exciting. It just keeps perpetuating the fun and stuff we do here. But as an educator, checking and seeing all the other educators here that teach other stuff, but also in our department too, the more teachers you can watch, the better.
Yeah, good practice to do.
Yeah. Because to see a good teacher in action, there's something to be said about those teachers. It's always impressive.
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer. I think it's helpful for other people to hear how educators iterate on their abilities. I think it's good to be public about that. And it's something that I have struggled with. And I actually have started streaming myself practicing the drums and intentionally playing things that I've never done before and I'm really bad at. And like, as somebody who's been playing for 20 years, over 20 years, like, it is very uncomfortable still to share something that doesn't sound good, because like everything that I have been conditioned to do over the years is like, you only share the final take, you share the best recording, etc. And to go publicly and share, here's me trying something and I'm going to fail over this next hour repeatedly. And it's been an interesting learning experience, and it's getting me even more comfortable with failure than I was previously.
Jared, if you were in middle school, you would be a fantastic student in the Dream Lab. Because what you just said, it's exactly the vulnerability that we look for and try to demonstrate and emulate from a day-to-day basis with the students. And I can imagine if you felt my palms right now, they're not dry, because I can just picture myself putting that type of video up and putting it on public display of me bombing, basically. And it's just like, wow, that's gutsy. But okay, it's up, it's done. Now what? You just learned so much in that experience. And now you're getting even more comfortable with it.
Yeah.
That's huge, because that comfortability, that confidence, it doesn't just stay in that place. It does transfer over time into other areas. Such a valuable thing, vulnerability.
Yeah, I had Monday off, and so I did a stream, and I was playing drum kit, which is not something that I'm like super comfortable on, and I did terrible on it. Like, there's so many things that I just was completely messing up on, and I was just like laughing it off like while going through it. But like, the fact that I'm leaving that up and still like gonna publish it on my YouTube channel as well later, like, is night and day from where I was a year ago, where I would never have shared something like that. And now my plan is to like revisit it like a year from now and go back to that recording and play the same thing and be like, look, here's where I was, and here's where I am 1 year later after consistent effort on this area. And I think it's beneficial for the musicians that I'm trying to help with this to see, like, look, I've been playing longer than most, like, people have been alive, like, on the drums, and to show, like, I am still terrible at some things and really good at other things, and it's all about the work that you put into it. So I think it's helpful to have these conversations and be public about like, here's how you actually improve, and here's where I was, and here's where I'm going to be.
It's huge. It brings you to their level. It shows that you can empathize with them in those experiences. You have to be willing to be able to put yourself out there, though. And I don't know that everybody's there. I don't know that everybody is willing to do that because it is uncomfortable. It doesn't feel good in that moment.
Yeah.
Now, the real question is, are you going to leave the comment section up or are you going to turn it off?
Oh, I'll keep it up. Yeah. Like I encourage people ask questions. And I mean, if people want to comment on the playing about how bad it was, you're right. It was. And yet I'm still an accomplished musician. Like you can have both those things in the same space.
See, there you go. You can be good and you can mess up sometimes.
Yeah.
As long as nobody gets hurt. Like in my space, there are times, right? Like you can't mess up on the table saw.
Yeah, that's true.
But that's why we have people there to show how to use it and help. And we demonstrate the vulnerability of asking for help or saying, I don't know. Because if you're not comfortable with being able to say those things in those moments, you're now putting yourself in danger. We can't have that. But that's specific to the engineering world.
So I'm curious, you have a lot of interests and appear to always be learning about education and about the content area and whatnot. How do you stave off that burnout that can come with working in the field of education and working what appears to be almost nonstop?
Luckily, very luckily, the content that I focus on in my classroom, it's continually changing because of what CS is. Things like AI and machine learning. When I'm covering that, I was covering this a few years ago. It's different now, and I've expanded that unit to include things like unintended bias in artificial intelligence and talking about why does that exist? And I have the students create their own biased models by accident and then show them why they did that, and then fix it. And they all fix it immediately. They know exactly how to do it. They get somebody else in, take a new picture. And what I think keeps me from burning out is seeing those moments of like, whoa, aha moments beyond like, aha. But I also really like the stuff that I teach. They always say like, oh, passionate teacher. I just find the content that I cover to be fun. It's fun for me to do. And same with music. I love playing music and I have fun playing music. I might be able to teach it, to be honest, but I wouldn't keep doing it in my off time if I didn't truly enjoy the stuff that I do in the classroom. So I think that keeps me from burning out. I'm lucky. There's no doubt about it. I'm very lucky to be able to say that.
In the interview that I did with Dan Schneider and then with Jason Bohr, they talked about how being able to switch between different aspects help them to not get burnt out just teaching the same thing over and over. So like being a percussionist, like if I got bored playing snare drum, cool, I could learn the marimba. If I got bored playing marimba, cool, I could learn the drum kit. If I get bored with that, like I could keep switching to different things when I started to get burned out in one area. It's still all learning the same umbrella of whether it's like percussion or computer science, but you're learning different aspects of it. So I don't know if that also resonates with you.
Totally. Sometimes if I know that I'm going to be teaching the same content, like basic HTML fundamentals, let's just say it's that, what I'll typically do is instead of like just going through that whole unit again for myself, I'll go over it, but I'll go down that path a little deeper into some other area that I'm not even going to cover in the class. And it keeps me like, oh yeah, this is kind of neat. And it gives me that edge like, oh, whoa, I remember what it was like to start learning this stuff because now I'm learning this new part of it.
Right.
That seems to help me.
I like that.
Yeah. Like with cybersecurity, I love it because, man, when that Log4j thing came out recently, I'm like, oh my gosh, what is this? This sounds really terrible. You know, it's impacting so many users. So I start looking into it and I start like experimenting with it on my own virtual machine. And I finally like get it set up in my own environment and I do it. I run it. And this is before I'm about to teach my cybersecurity unit, which I already had planned. No mention of Log4j. That day, one of my students asks me now about a 0 day. And she says, yeah, my dad was talking about this thing. And I said, wait a minute, are you talking about Log4j, which has been in the news? She's like, yeah, Log4j. I'm like, you won't believe this, but I have this running in the back. She goes, oh my gosh, I can't wait to go home and tell my dad. I was like, well, I can show you what it is. I was like, okay. So I'm curious what that conversation was like when she got home. But it's just one of those examples where it got everybody excited. And that really had nothing to do with what we were covering in that class that day. But it just so happened it worked out. I'm always happy when it does.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I just had like a mini little reflection on what you're just saying. Like the teachers who were best at pulling in current day topics and relating it to the class were the government and social studies teachers. They'd have like every Wednesday was like current event day where you talk about like what's going on in the news, how does that relate to social studies, government, etc. We had some of that in a couple of the CS classes that I've done online, or like people like on YouTubers who will talk about that, but like very rarely would any of that occur in the music education classes that I take or the music performance classes, because like there's such a disconnect between in-school music and all of the music that is made outside of school. So that is an interesting idea of like, well, why can't CS be more topical and why couldn't we bring that into the class more? Like I would bring in like when Assassin's Creed Unity came out, they had this like no face bug where like it would not load the texture of your skin. So it'd show like the eyeballs and the mouth moving without like skin covering it. And it was hilarious and horrifying looking. So like I would pull that up for like the middle schoolers and be like, look, here's what this bug is doing. And here's what that would look like if you did that in Scratch and like what is going on with that. And so we talk about that, but yeah, I don't know. That's just me kind of reflecting out loud how it would be nice to be more topical when connecting things with current events.
Yeah. I mean, either current events or student interests in my situations, because I had another student just the other day who said, hey, I didn't see at the beginning of the year a unit covering cryptocurrencies. I said, that's because we don't have one. And I said, but wait a minute, are you interested in cryptocurrencies? And she said, yes. I said, okay, well, this sounds exciting. Well, what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to go study some crypto. So I ended up building my own token on Solana. I had to create like a whole cloud server and all this stuff. I was going back and forth in Linux. It was wild. I didn't know if I was going to be able to do it. I had to buy some Sol. This is all like new stuff to me, because I was never dabbling around in this crypto world. And then I'm going down this rabbit hole into the NFT stuff. And it was so much fun. And I don't know if I would have done it if I didn't get that question. I don't even know if we're going to cover cryptocurrency still. I'd like to, or at least like say, hey, you know what? Let's have lunch. We're going to talk crypto. I'm going to show you how to do it. It's funny how things kind of, I would probably fit it into some of the command line stuff that I do currently. A lot of times what I'll have to do when I get into these situations is, okay, so where does cryptocurrency fit into the big overarching picture of what I want all the students that graduate from 7th grade CS, what are they walking away with?
Right.
So do they need to know deeply about how cryptocurrencies are exchanged and how to mint tokens in blockchain and all this stuff?
What do you wish there's more research on that could inform your own practices in the classroom?
I'd like to know effective methods or truly effective with data backing it, methods of getting minorities of basically any minority into the field of computer science through education, because there's this disparity, and there has been, and it's changing in the grand scheme of things. Now, granted, I'm in an all-girls school, so they're all getting this, but why is there a lot of programs, more boys than girls, going into these CS electives? Not everywhere, but in general. And what effective strategies are mitigating that? And then going deeper for Black and Brown, what is an effective strategy for engaging that community? The thing about computer science and the biases that are built into it, it comes from this non-diverse collective of people making the stuff. That's part of it. It's just one piece. But if we had really great strategies to bring everybody in, I don't know the most effective strategies, and I would love to, because I would be implementing them every day.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's research out there. Do you know?
There's some, but not enough. So it's a question that's underexplored at the moment.
Yeah. I think it's a valuable question to explore.
Yeah. What's something that you're working on that you need help with?
One of the things I do often in my classes is bring experts from the field into the classroom, either physically or through Zoom. And I am always looking for guest speakers in any of my classes, whether it's an expert in the field of any area of engineering or any area of CS. And being that it's an all-girls school, to have a female presence as that voice is always great because it's such a great method of representation for everyone here. And I always enjoy hearing from them too, because I'm always learning when they're in the room with me. And then I get to ask the questions too. It's a lot of fun. But that would be the one ask if anybody ever wants to partner up or knows somebody that might want to see what it's like talking to a bunch of youngsters about what you do. That would be great.
Cool. At the end, we'll make sure to share your contact information, like in the show notes and whatnot, so people can reach out to you. Do you have any questions for myself or for the field?
Well, I am curious, Jared, about the chapters that led you to this podcast.
Yeah. So specifically to the podcast, I have a bit of an obsessive nature in that when I'm passionate about something, I will just nonstop learn about it. So I'm really interested in different topics like productivity, or I'm interested in like real estate as an investment strategy. So I listen to a ton of podcasts on like those topics. So I dive deep into them and listen to them at like 3 times speed so I can get through more information, etc. So I've really been interested in podcasts for years, and I felt like there wasn't enough discussion in computer science education on some topics that I think we should discuss. Like there's not enough conversation on, okay, here's this research, but how do we actually do it in practice? What does this look like in the classroom? Yeah. What are the implications, etc.? So that disconnect between practitioner and scholar, and the fact that I felt like the field wasn't discussing equity enough, or like other areas like interest-driven learning. Like instead we were focusing on future jobs as opposed to like, well, what are kids interested in? Can't we explore that some more? So because I wasn't seeing enough of those discussions in various conferences and webinars, I was like, wait, I'm really interested in podcasts. I have like a good like setup to record things and whatnot, and I want to bridge this gap between practitioner and scholar. And I am a practitioner and have a PhD, so like I can merge all these things together and then create the podcast. And so it was really my attempt to help advance or shape the discourse in CS education towards topics that I felt like the field should be discussing more. But it's also been a way of like holding myself accountable to staying up on latest research. Like if I'm going to be releasing an episode where I unpack some scholarship, then I need to know not only like the seminal works from years ago, but also what's going on today. And that helps me with the research grants that I work on. But then conversations like this allow me to learn from the guests that I interview, and it allows me to make great connections. So like overall, like I'm learning a ton through the process, but then it's also like fulfilling my own interests in wanting to do a podcast.
It's pretty neat. And I'm sure that you've gotten a lot out of each one.
Yeah.
But I think the best part about it is you can share it with everybody, and then other people can get the same out of it.
Yeah, and the connections snowball. So like what I will do after each interview and like after we get the episode like ready to go is I'll just like, hey, now that this is scheduled for publication, do you have any recommendations of future guests? And then I'll get like 1 or 2 introductions, and then that leads to more conversations with people I might not have ever connected with had I not had that initial introduction. And so it snowballs to like meeting more people and having interesting conversations. So it's a really good networking thing. It's a really good way of staying on top of research. But then as an introvert, it's also really good for me to get used to being more public with my own thinking and getting feedback on that in a much faster way than I do with all the publications I've done. Like some of them, I had a publication come out a year ago that I wrote 3 years prior. Like it takes that long sometimes for like a book to come out. So
wow, I didn't realize the publication process can take that amount of time, and I guess longer too at times.
Yeah, so that one was for an edited handbook And that publication, it just takes a long time. When the editors are trying to corral like 40 academics to all write 40 different chapters around a topic area, like many academics are very slow to respond or to fulfill their obligations. So like sometimes it just takes forever because you send out your first draft and then several people will be late on those. And then that delays the reviews, and the reviewers are going to be late on those reviews. So then that delays when you can actually start working on your next draft of it. And like, it just keeps snowballing. So some of those take forever. Like the fastest journal article I think I wrote was like published in about a year. But most of times it takes longer than that. At least it depends on the field and the journal or publication. Like a podcast episode I could record today and have it out tomorrow if I wanted to and get feedback on.
Yeah. I typically do reflection just, after something or in my mind, or if I need to, I'll write something down. That's a whole nother world when you're saying it out loud. If you're going out and asking for others to join on a podcast, it's a very cathartic and therapeutic experience.
Yeah, it's been a fun experience. I am curious, like down the road, at some point, when am I going to get some backlash? Especially when I talk about like equity and CS education. There are some people who think we should not talk about that. And because I'm still waiting for that moment where somebody tries to cancel me because I bring up equity discussions.
The equity piece needs to be discussed now because it needs to become more equitable, because the longer it takes for it to not be equitable, the deeper the hole we're digging.
Right.
And that has some really heavy future ramifications down the line. It's worth talking about.
Yeah, which is why I'm putting it out there. So where might people go to connect with you and the organizations that you work with?
I would be able to be connected most easily via my email address, which is ALILHOLT@baldwinschool.org. You could also reach me at my Twitter handle @maker_things.
And with that concludes this week's episode of the CSK8 podcast. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Addison, and I hope you check out the show notes at jaredoleary.com, where there's a bunch of computer science, coding, gaming, and even drumming content on my website. Stay tuned next week for another episode, and until then, I hope you are staying safe and are having a wonderful week.